For New Order, yeah. New Order's Power, Corruption, and Lies. In the opening montage, you heard a clip from Age of Consent, and now you're going to hear a clip from The Village.
Shyamalan movie.
Not the Village people, just The Village. All right, so Power, Corruption, and Lies by New Order comes in at number 31 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 3 in 1983, number 257 of all time. It also made Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 262, and it's also their highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. We're going to be covering a couple of other New Order albums, so this is kind of an interesting. I'll do the bio. I'll do a quick end cap, but maybe I'll throw in some tidbits when we cover the two other albums that we'll be doing later on
Matt's tasty
in this
tidbits.
series. Matt's tasty tidbits. You got it. All right, so we this is our first time covering New Order, but we kind of covered them before twice with the episodes on Joy Division, because that's where this band came from. So Power, Corruption, Lies is New Order's second studio album, actually, and it was released on May 2nd, 1983. Fun fact, that was 3 years to the day of Joy Division's last live performance with Ian Curtis. So, found that interesting. And so the main members of New Order that were also in Joy Division include Bernard Sumner, who was also the lead singer of New Order, taking over for Ian Curtis. He was also playing the guitar and keyboards. Peter Hook was on bass, Stephen Morris on drums, and they also had Jillian Gilbert on keys and guitar as well. So again, they were originally Joy Division. They released 2 albums, Unknown Pleasures and Closer, but the band was disbanded after the suicide of lead singer Ian Curtis on May 18th, 1980. Again, this was on the eve that they were supposed to tour the United States. And so the band members decided that they were going to go on. They did not want to go on as Joy Division, though. They figured that would not be the right thing to do. So they started, the 3 of them started an unnamed band, and they kind of started writing and getting back to work very quickly after Curtis's death. These guys, again, were really young. They were probably like 22, 23 years old, somewhere around that area. And they were, they were hungry to go to America. They were just about to do it. So, and they probably, weren't terribly their ability to cope with this type of loss was it was a very difficult time, so they just figured, let's just start making music. So they start kind of writing some songs. They did debut their first live performance on July 29th, 1980 at Manchester's Beach Club. And they finally came up with the name of New Order from their manager, Rob Gretton, who found it in an article in the Guardian titled The People's New Order of Kampuchea, which is also, I guess, a name for Cambodia. And they figured that let's go with New Order. They also agreed to go with this name, despite the fact that it was previously used for another band, The New Order, which was fronted by Ron Ashton from the Stooges. That was the band, I guess, that he formed after the Stooges broke up. But they didn't last very long, so I thought that was kind of a little tie-in, an interesting tie-in to a former CTS band. Each of the members tried off as to be the new lead singer, but they eventually gave it to Sumner. And they knew that they wanted a 4th member of the band. They wanted to add somebody who they felt they knew fairly well, whose style would have meshed with their own. The manager, Gretton, suggested that they go with Jillian Gilbert. She actually performed with Joy Division a couple of times in the past, and she also she was in another all-female band, and she was drummer Stephen Morris's girlfriend. So, and she agreed to join the band in October of 1980. And so they start releasing their first singles, and this is another one of those British bands that pretty much a lot of their singles never made it to albums. And they have the biggest selling album that they have in the United States is called Substance. It's from 1987, and it's really a compilation album of a lot of their big hits. And New Order has some pretty big singles that never made it onto albums. So, and it's actually, that album is number 96 in the 1980s. We're not covering it because it's a compilation, but if anybody's interested in New Order and the stuff that you might have heard on the radio, you're probably going to be more likely to hear that on Substance than any of their actual albums. So I would recommend it. I know that a lot of those songs that I personally enjoy. So
is Blue Monday on that one? I like
Blue Monday is on that. Yep. Okay. So, and we'll get to Blue Monday in a second. There's a funny story with that. So, the sound of the band when they first started, so they come out with their first album, and it's called Movement. It's released in 1981, and it still has the Joy Division sound to it, although it's kind of a really interesting bridge between Joy Division and what they do with this record, Power, Corruption, and Lies, which is considered New Order becoming New Order. So Movement is an album where, a lot of people kind of found it unfocused. I actually really liked it because I do like that Joy Division sound, and it's got kind of that, more the rock guitar oriented music, more with the dance music, which is kind of more of the direction that they would go into. So I did listen to that, and I would recommend anybody that's interested to check it out as well.
It sounds like them in transition, right? For them,
it's definitely, yeah. And it also shows them starting to use synthesizers, which became a big part of the New Order sound. But you still get the dark and melodic and moody kind of imprint that they would have with that they had with Joy Division. So it wasn't that first album wasn't really a fun experience for the band. Bassist Peter Hook said that the only good thing that came out of those sessions was the fact that their producer Martin Hannett, who was also the producer of the Joy Division records, taught them actually how to use a mixing board. So that was the last album that they ever worked with Hannett. From all of the future albums, they were self-producing their records. So the band goes to visit New York in 1981, and this kind of really introduces them to more electronic music. And post-disco was a genre I don't think we've talked about. There's post-everything, so I guess why not post-disco as well?
Post-disco.
Yeah, so they get more into this music. Stephen Morris teaches himself to use to do drum programming, so being able to incorporate more of a synthesized drum sound. And they release a couple of more singles. And as I said before, Power, Corruption, and Lies really solidified their new sound with more electronics and synthesizers, very danceable qualities. It's really kind of early techno is what you're getting here with this record, and house music as well. So they released this record on Factory Records, which was also the record company that released the Joy Division records. This is do we talk about 24 Hour Party People? Is that a movie that we've talked about before, Josh?
No,
we did.
But
we did a little bit.
We did a little bit. But yeah, I watched a little bit of that. But that basically it's from 2002 or 2001, and it basically is kind of like a story of Factory Records and the main guy that was Tony Williams, perhaps, maybe that's his name. I have to clean that stack, but so it's got that British humor, so it's pretty entertaining. But
yeah, Steve Coogan stars.
Right. So it kind of talks about Factory Records. So they kind of had an interesting deal with Factory Records, which was their label for the majority of their career, at least in the 80s. They didn't have an official contract. Factory Records was very much a record label for the artists. They did not want to rip them off as every other artist or label did. They shared profits pretty evenly, and they didn't have that contract. So Joy Division had all the rights to their music, and so that was something that was very appealing for them. Yep.
It's Tony Wilson.
Tony Wilson. So there you go. So the album cover was created by Peter Seville. This was a graphic artist that worked with Joy Division a lot. It's based on a reproduction of the painting called A Basket of Roses by a French artist by the name of Henri Fontaine Latour. And he originally looked for a Renaissance portrait of a dark prince to kind of go along with the theme of the album title. He couldn't find something that he wanted, but his girlfriend suggested, and kind of mockingly, that he used this Basket of Roses painting. And he kind of realized that it was a great idea, saying that it represented the seductiveness, as the entryways into power, corruption, and lies often are seductive. So that was the tie-in for him there. So, Josh, you mentioned Blue Monday. That was a single that came out a little bit before this record. Actually, it was not officially included on it, but it's not part of the track listing that you'll see in most listings. However, it was tacked on for some releases later on. Blue Monday, the funny story behind that is that it became the best-selling 12-inch single of all time. So look at the LP. It's basically like a full-size record, right? But they put it make it as a single, so the grooves are further apart. It gives more of a full sound. It's better for better sound quality, so you can hear more into it. It's better for dancing, that track is very much a dancing track, right?
Yep.
And so it sold a ton. But the problem was that the packaging behind it was so elaborate and expensive that the label lost 5 pence per copy that it sold. So the more and there's a funny line in that movie where they're like, this is going to cost us money for every copy it sells. And then Steve Coogan's character's like, this is different. Somebody's going to buy it anyway. And it becomes this huge, massive hit. And so even though that New Order had this really favorable record deal, they were really bad with money, not only with losing money with the records that they produced, but they were also involved in the opening and operation of the Hacienda Club, which was a dance club really at the center at the beginning of like the rave culture and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It hemorrhaged money. Part of the reason for that was so many people were taking E. And they didn't drink alcohol, so they think the alcohol sales were pretty poor. So the Hacienda Club cost them tons of money. The band later.
Hold on, I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes for my future club.
The band famously did not. Well, particularly Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner. The longer that they went on, the more they didn't get along. They had very different personalities. Sumner was more of the catalyst behind the dance and the electronics. Peter Hook wanted more of the more of the rock sensibility of the previous Joy Division records. But because the band kept losing money, it forced them later on, like in the 90s, to reunite, to get back together and make records. So I thought that was interesting. But so I think I'll kind of stop it there. They have released a total of 10 albums. The most recent was 2015's Music Complete. That was the first and only record without Peter Hook, because he did leave the band in 2007. He basically had enough. There's a lot more that goes into their relationship, and maybe we'll touch on that when we talk about the other two records. But I think it's going to be Josh's turn to go first. Yeah. Josh, what did you think of this record?
Well, compared to, it's hard not to compare that to Joy Division since we just listened to them recently, but this is an album that sounds completely different than Joy Division and is something I responded to immediately as a result. I really liked it. I liked the synth nature of it. They obviously love the drum machine because that's all over this. I didn't know that Blue Monday came out before this album, but it sounds like on that song 586 that they took their own synth part.
It's
from Blue
it's
Monday.
It's very reminiscent. Yes.
Yeah. Yep. And I think it's a strong album. It seems, Ian Curtis in my mind and Joy Division sounds so dour and depressing, and I feel like this is, even though the title is kind of ominous, I feel like this is a more upbeat album and a more positive sounding album and sound, and I think that's part of the reason I responded to it also. I think Age of Consent is just an awesome opening album right from the start. It's just got whatever the opening guitar part is with the synth is kind of infectious, and I think a lot of bands have tried to rip that sound off.
That's probably the bass is what you're hearing actually.
Yeah.
Peter Hook's melodic bass line.
Yeah, it's great. And then I guess the second track, We All Stand, kind of sounds more like Joy Division in a way. I think it has a repeating sound. It's kind of haunting, or echoey, or something that recalls Joy Division in my mind. But then they bounce right back with The Village, which you just heard in the opening, and is strong on the synth and has that upbeat, happy feeling. I kind of like the dance nature that they have to this album as well. I think that's a strong component of it, and I think they do some interesting things. There is on 586. It's interesting that they end with it getting slower and slower at the end. It kind of like tails off, and the beat get slower and slower. I think more songs should do that to end songs. It's a good way to wrap it up. And I think honestly I didn't pay attention to the lyrics, but they aren't afraid to do instrumentals as well. The song Ecstasy, second to last track, is an instrumental song.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself liking the album all the way through. Your Silent Face, Ultraviolence, or other great songs. Ultraviolence probably a reference to Clockwork Orange, I would imagine. And I thought they all had really good hooks. Some of the songs, I think because of the dance nature, some of the songs probably could be considered repetitive and stand on just kind of the instrumentation and the kind of looping nature of the music alone versus the lyrics. So I think that could be a criticism. I think some of this, even though the songs aren't very long, some of them do feel long like that because of the repetition. So I definitely could see how somebody would not like that. But overall, I think it's strong enough that I found myself moving to this album considerably and enjoying what they brought to it. I think I like the vibe of them a lot more than I did for Joy Division. So yeah, thumbs up for me.
Yeah, this is an interesting album for me. The bookends, Age of Consent and Leave Me Alone, in my opinion, are by far the most interesting songs on the album. I enjoy both of them. And if you put those two next to each other, I know both songs. I know those two. I know 586. They're the three songs from this album I know from just listening. 586 is the first time where New Order on this album, I feel like, sounds like the New Order sounds that I recognize, that sound that I always associate with New Order, and to a further extent bands like Depeche Mode and Erasure and stuff that comes later in the 80s. This is the first time I'm getting into that battle that I'm going to have with industrial type music, I think. And I will be interested to see how that progresses for me, because I will firmly say that as we listen to more of it, I think I'm going to have a more sophisticated palette. Full disclosure, electronic, what I would consider industrial tech, early techno, later techno, has historically been a hard listen for me. I don't think maybe, we've talked about like stuff that's difficult for all of us, right? Like different genres. I think this is the first time I'm confronting a genre in the way that Matt, you and Josh, you have confronted stuff that doesn't hit your ear in a certain way. And I feel like this sound is a tough one for me. It's very detached. It sounds like, Josh, to some degree, you had like a little bit of an emotional connection with it. It hits you kind of there. I call this like morgue music. It's cold. It's ominous. It's dark.
Sure.
No, it isn't even. There's a in its own way, there's a warmness to things like Kraftwerk that, even though it's synthy and heavy, I don't know how to describe it. I feel like it's, robots trying to connect humanly, and it's like almost charming. This is sort of like robots keeping you at a distance, talking about human emotions. So 586 is interesting because I don't dislike the song, but it's where I'm like, okay, I'm listening to a New Order album right now. It's that real clear song. The longer the songs, the more the loop feel of it came for me. That's a tough one for me. Sometimes I get to this sound, and by about the 3.5 minute mark, I'm like, okay, show me something else. And the trick that gets shown to me is just a slight variation of the beat. It's not like a metronomic beat, but it's very much keeping a certain consistency. With that being said, I'm not going to go thumbs down on this. This will be a reserve judgment until I feel like I get more of the bands that come afterwards, so I can appreciate it. I could it possibly be a Velvet Underground type thing for me? And that as I'm listening to it, I'm not processing it, and then it's like, holy shit, like it's everywhere, and now like I get this, right? I think one of the reasons my sophistication for this album is not there is because I've made consumerist choices that have stayed away from this type of music. And one of the good things about doing a podcast like this is I'm going to now not make those choices. So reserve judgment. But it was not an unpleasant listen, but I don't know if I connected with it in the same way you did, Josh.
So you don't feel, I feel like this is just the next iteration of electronic music, leading from where Kraftwerk is, but you sound like you've always kind of responded more to that early electronic music than
yes, the early electronic music very much speaks to me more than this did. I shouldn't say very much. It speaks to me more. It something about it sonically and environmentally speaks. Even something like what Brian Eno was doing, some of the stuff we covered, speaks to me more.
Yeah.
Than this does. I feel like I don't want to say this because it's going to sound like a minimum. I do feel though that it's hard to detach this music from the culture that it's being made for, like dance clubs where the goal is to alter your mind.
Yep.
Like whereas I could listen to Kraftwerk in a variety of states, right, or in a variety of states. It's hard for me to imagine that the purest form of listening to this is, off your face on E, in an industrial warehouse somewhere in the 80s, like had to be there, and later, that expands to rave culture and stuff. But even when I compare it to like the 90s version of this, things like I know if I say Prodigy, people are like, oh, they're like not the real, it's real, they're like the commercial end of it. But, I'm just going with that for what people might know. Even that stuff spoke to me more. There was like a visceral anger energy in there, I guess, that almost had not silent, but had like kind of like a little bit of metal, a little bit of punk in it. I think that like just spoke to me more. This is sort of more like I felt like I was eavesdropping on a culture that I don't quite understand and never had an entryway of appeal to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No,
but I reserve judgment because I want to listen to more and I want to put it in its proper context. So
it sounds like me and hardcore, pretty much. And I think
Josh, I like this more than you like hardcore. I do. Because
that could be fair, but I'm just saying. But I'm just talking about in terms of like how it's, why it's because it's not like it never really kind of came across as something that you were a part of, right? Not that I was like a part of like rave culture, but I think it's interesting. Yes, Josh, this I think it's interesting. You're saying this is kind of like a happier, lighter tone of John's finding it cold, and I agree with both of you. I think I'm hearing both of those things. I think the band does. I did see some interviews with them, and they were particularly trying to kind of deviate away from the Joy Division sound, trying to get a little bit more happier. Yeah. And they also, it was interesting too that they're kind of I learned a lot about them, and Joy Division. I think that these guys and their story is very interesting. So I recommend watching, any interviews with them. There was a documentary I found from '93, and it's really weirdly done. Like there's this weird that the female narrator's kind of got like this sexual, really like velvety voice kind of a thing. It's very dramatic, so that's weird. And then Bernard Sumner's getting interviewed while getting his hair buzzed, like at a barber shop, and like Peter Hook's like at this, I don't know where he's like at a club somewhere with like 5 cross-dressed men behind him, just sitting there like with straight faces, listening to him interview. It's just a very but the story's interesting, and the guys are fascinating themselves. And they didn't really do interviews right when this came out because they knew that they were going to be asked about Ian Curtis, and they didn't want to answer those questions. So people said, "Oh, you're so shy with the media," and they're like, "Well, only because of this, really." So there was a little bit of mystery with them. All that being said, I did like this album. I think I still like Joy Division better than this sound, but I thought overall that this was I don't mind. I don't mind electronic music to an extent. It's definitely like rave and dance culture is not my thing either, but I do gravitate to this in some way. I do like, some of the sounds that you're getting here. To me, a lot of this was like I heard a lot of Cure and a lot of Depeche Mode and definitely Kraftwerk. Like your Silent Face, the beginning of that sounded like a Kraftwerk song. Like that tone of the keyboards there was a total direct homage or whatever to Kraftwerk. So that's what I got from that. But the guitar tone of a lot of this is very much the Cure. So I don't know. I know we've covered the Cure. I guess technically we kind of covered 2 albums because I screwed up. But that's still the Cure early in its in its creation. So I don't know if one influenced the other, but it's got that sound,
I feel like where the Cure go after the early albums is like if Peter Hook had won the battle for New Order.
Yes. Okay.
And
I would agree with that.
He didn't.
Yes.
So it didn't. So that's how I would say
correct.
that. Matt.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a good point. So and I like all those bands, and I don't know a ton of Depeche Mode, but what I do know I like very much. And so yes, I'm hearing the industrial. There's Nine Inch Nails stuff in here too, like toned down Nine Inch Nails, but it's still in there. So. I agree with you, Josh. Some of these songs do kind of, like 586 is a little bit of a long song, kind of just, kind of goes on. And I agree with you too, John. I think Age of Consent that's a great opening track, and that's kind of more on the happier end of things. And Leave Me Alone is a very strong. Those might be my 2 favorite as well. But I really like The Village. I really like Your Silent Face. I don't mind the instrumental song Ecstasy. I think that's pretty solid as well. I think the only one that I'm a little meh on is We All Stand. That's the one that's it's kind of a little bit more of the moodier. I don't know. It's kind of more sound effects rather than like song structure. It's kind of they're kind of going for a mood there, but it's definitely interesting. And I don't think I knew any of these really. Like the New Order stuff that I know is probably all on Substance, and I agree too. 586 is very much a Blue Monday, it's like very similar riffing on that. So. So I do like this. And the thing that's kind of sad with what we're covering, because we're going to cover 2 other albums, and their best songs are not going to be on those albums. That's why like something like True Faith, which is a fantastic song. Like that's just like there's some really good melodies in here. Peter Hook, even though, and that's one of the things that when I was researching them that a lot of people were talking about was yes, Bernard Sumner wanted them to go more into the electronic kind of dance area. Peter Hook was fighting to kind of keep it in rock, and the way that they kind of balanced that out was like his bass lines are very prominent in a lot of their songs, and they're very melodic, and so it kind of holds the band from being a full-blown dance band.
Well, that's the Cure part. That's where it's anchored with the Cure.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where they're really walking that line, and he's kind of towing them in. So even though they ended up really, really hating each other later on, they kind of needed each other to balance that out. I hear you can hear his bass lines and that sound throughout the whole record, and I really do like that and appreciate it. So I'm thumbs up on this. I maybe I'm in the middle of you guys because I think I still like Joy Division better, and I like their first record that what was it called, Movement. I think that was, I don't know, I might like that better than this because that really does to me a good job of blending the 2 sounds together. I'm interested in covering the other 2 records. They were really big in the 80s. They did some stuff in the 90s and the 2000s, but the 80s is the main kind of stuff that they were known for. So I'm interested to cover those as well. But I'm thumbs up on them. Very interesting story, and I would encourage people to go listen to Movement, to go listen to Substance as well.
Do you think they crossed over to the U.S. very much? Because I feel like rave culture is kind of a different beast in the U.K. and kind of more prominent than it ever became here.
Mean, this is not my genre, and I can name you like 6 New Order songs, like Bizarre Love Triangle, and the tracks that Matt meant, Blue Monday, and
I'm gonna have to.
Regrets
a great song.
I recognized, So I mean, it's There's enough that I can name 5 or 6 songs in a genre I don't. So
I'm gonna have to listen to Substance then because I think I only know Blue Monday off the top of my head.
The story I always tell is that I had a friend in college, and I remember that I saw something that said every Depeche Mode album had sold 3 million copies. And I said, what the fuck? Like, Depeche Mode? Like I knew them, but I'm like, I didn't do it. And then like I started looking at friends' record collections, and I saw like a surprisingly large number of Depeche Mode albums, including my one friend Julie, who was like, "Oh yeah, I've had all of them." And like and I'm like, it was a real eye opener for me. And I know that I forget what stadium it might have been the Rose Bowl or something, but it was one of these things where they put tickets on sale. And I'm using Depeche Mode because they're kind of same lane, right, for this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like they ended up selling out a huge American stadium, and people were like, "What the hell? Like, how is this band this big?" And it was like we were totally sleeping on this. And like we'll get to Depeche Mode eventually, but I'm sure we'll come across that story. But yeah, this stuff was in the. I would argue that probably this is the most mainstream electronic period in America. It's certainly bigger than like the 70s electronic stuff is, and I would argue it's probably bigger than the 90s. It's bigger than like the Chemical Brothers or some of that stuff like Moby and stuff. I mean, the Prodigy had songs on MTV, but I don't think they were anywhere near as big as New Order and like Depeche Mode and stuff were in the 80s.
I would agree with that. And two, they during like at some point they broke off and did side projects. So Bernard Sumner did a project with Johnny Marr from the Smiths. Did you ever hear about this, John?
No. Yes, I am familiar with it.
There's
two other guys in it too. It was
Electronic is the name of the band, and then Peter Hook, like he got all pissed off, and he formed a band called Revenge.
They hate each other.
Revenge.
Peter Hook and Morrissey, notably, I think, hate each other.
Peter Hook and Morrissey do?
I know that for a fact they hate each other, and I don't think it ended too well with Johnny Marr. And I think there were other members of British like post-punk era bands in that electronic as well. I'm trying to remember.
Well,
but
Peter Hook also, I would just listen to his interviews because he's very outspoken and he's similar to Morrissey and like funny lines and stuff. He's also written 3 memoirs that are like 500 pages each that are just like eviscerate Bernard Sumner. So he's got a lot to say. So he's an interesting character. But I would probably agree with you, John. I think that this is the stuff that like. Yeah, like this isn't Depeche Mode. There's probably others that really the 80s kind of were bigger bands or bigger names, and then what you would get maybe later in the 90s. I would probably agree with that.
And I'm incorrect. It is just Johnny Marr and Hook.
And Bernard Sumner.
Bernard Sumner, excuse me, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Peter Hook was in Revenge.
So you think New Order's bigger than LCD Sound System?
For
sure.
2000s? They're bigger than LCD Sound System.
You think so? I don't.
What LCD Sound System album sold 1 million copies? I bet you New Order has multiple albums that sold 1 million copies.
Okay.
Like worldwide, certainly, and
let's see,
like Technique and stuff that comes later.
Yeah,
like, I don't even think it's LCD Sound System to me is like an underground band. The New Order was like a.
What about Daft Punk?
No. I'd probably say
I think New Order is bigger than Daft Punk.
Food for thought. Another.
We're having the essential questions risen again in a different form. So,
for sure.
No, they're pretty big. I mean, some of the they did sell a ton. They did have a big influence. And they've got there's songs that still like hit like movie soundtracks and that are still pretty big. So.
Yeah, I think you might not be aware, Josh, of how big they were.
That's entirely possible. Sure.
Yeah. So I'll be curious to see. Like, I'll have to look that up, or maybe somebody can look it up for there because I want to